Hi, I'm Noel Kingsbury, and with my colleague Annie Guilfoyle, we run Garden Masterclass, which we started 5 years ago to do educational workshops for garden and landscape people in the British Isles.
Hello, and I'm Annie Guilfoyle. We still do live events, in-person events all over the British Isles and also into Europe, in fact. But since COVID happened globally, we now have an online program and we do webinars as well. So we are now a global garden community.
All our information-packed webinars are recorded and they're available from our website. They're pay to view, but members get a discount.
And this is a recording of our weekly public service broadcast that we like to call our Thursday Garden Chat. It goes out at 6 o'clock on a Thursday live, and that's 6 o'clock UK time. We talk to people from all over the world, designers, gardeners, horticulturalists, nursery people, botanists. And so it's always a great range of people and always very exciting.
We've got recordings here on YouTube, but masses more on our website, and our members will have access to even more. In fact, we've got hundreds of hours on our online library.
And take a look at our website and see what's coming up on our diary pages. Everything is listed in the diary, so webinars, live events, everything that we do, it's all in a chronological order, and you can click through to a link to get in more information or to buy tickets. And you may want to sign up for a monthly newsletter, our mailing list, or you might like to become a member.
We do these weekly events for free, as indeed do our speakers, but we have costs, which is why we really appreciate donations, and you can make donations from our homepage.
Well, we really hope that you enjoyed this recording, and please come back and try.
Now, our guest this evening, I first met Seamus O'Brien probably about 10 years ago. I was in Ireland visiting various gardens, visiting people, and they all said, oh, you must go and meet Seamus O'Brien. So I went down to Kilmacurragh, which was an old estate with a kind of ruined house and clearly lots of work going on. This had been incorporated into one of the gardens of the National Botanic Gardens of Ireland. And Seamus was indeed an extraordinarily enthusiastic guide to the place. And Kilmacurragh seemed to be one of those projects that was clearly going places with a huge amount of clearing and replanting going on. There seemed to be much optimism about schedules and budgets. And I remember being shown around all the cardiocrinum growing facilities to sort of try and get this absolutely extraordinary plant reliably flowering somewhere in the garden every year. I've been back to it, I think, at least once since then, I think with a largely Argentinian tour group who were quite entertaining. So Seamus has got a really exciting project at Kilmacurragh, and he's had a pretty exciting life. So now, Seamus, you've got the Wicklow Mountains behind you. You've got snow on them already, I see.
I do. It's snowed pretty heavily here, Noel. Noel and Annie, thank you for the introduction. And good evening, everybody. I know not everybody, it's not evening for all of you, but good evening, good morning if you're in the Western Hemisphere. I'm going to share the screen with you and I'll get straight into it. Good. Okay. So the opening view is just behind Kilmacurragh House. It's the Broad Walk here at the National Botanic Gardens of Ireland, Kilmacurragh. So we're situated just 40 miles south of Dublin. We're a late 17th century estate that was for 250 years was home to the Acton family. They'd settled here in 1650. Lived here right up until the 1940s, and in 2006 I moved down from our main site at Glasnevin in Dublin to manage the replanting of the estate. So Noel and Annie has asked me to speak for about 40 minutes really about what got me into horticulture, how I trained, the gardens that I've worked in. So I'm going to sort of briefly take you through some of the places that I've been, and of course it all begins in Glasnevin in Dublin. So Glasnevin, before 1922, when Ireland gained independence, was a Royal Botanic Gardens. It was a sister garden of both Kew and Edinburgh, and within the British Empire, they were the three major powerhouses and distribution centres of newly introduced plants over the course of their history. One of our most famous directors, hopefully you can see my cursor, this is Dr. David Moore. He became our director in the 1830s, and over a 42-year period, he brought gardens to almost to the pinnacle of their fame. And he was succeeded when he died in 1879 by his 22-year-old son, Frederick Moore, later Sir Frederick Moore. There's only ever been 3 people knighted for services to horticulture. So his son Frederick was the first of those trio to be knighted in 1911. If you're wondering who the other 2 were, it's Sir Harry Veitch and Sir Harold Hillier. So these are views of Glasnevin, the great palm house, the curvilinear range, and then Glasnevin, as I mentioned, of course, it's a similar history to both Kew and Edinburgh, in that you get these sort of successive dynasties of great horticulturists, father and son teams. In Kew, it was the Hookers. In Glasnevin, it was the Moores, David Moore, his son Sir Frederick Moore. This is his wife, Lady Moore, who's equally a really brilliant horticulturist. And then on the extreme right is Charles Moore, who trained at the old Trinity College Botanic Gardens as a horticulturist and went on to become the director of the Sydney Botanic Gardens. I remember traveling in China in 2002. We were collecting in Hubei province, and I was traveling with a large group, including Jimmy Blake and Helen Dillon. And somebody asked all of us what sort of motivated us in horticulture, or when did we become interested? And we stopped and talked for a moment, and all 3 of us suddenly realized actually that there was never a point in our lives when we weren't interested in plants. So in the 1990s, I studied at Glasnevin, and then of course worked as a student in various different gardens throughout Ireland during my student years. Powerscourt was my first sort of big bash at horticulture. Powerscourt is just south of Dublin, here in County Wicklow. It was the seat of the various Viscount Powerscourt, but the garden that you see today was the creation of the 7th Viscount Powerscourt, who travelled on his grand tours, brought back these wonderful marbles from all over Europe, mainly from France and from Rome. And he and his son spent over 30 years laying out what's recognized as the last great formal landscape to be laid out in Western Europe. The house, sadly, was a burnt ruin, absolutely roofless, resulting from a devastating fire in 1974. And the Slasinger family, who presently own the estate, re-roofed the building and saved it in more or less recent years. Following summer was spent on another great garden, but in an absolutely different corner of Ireland. This is Garnish Island. It's also known as Ilmacullen, which comes from the Irish Ilon Naquillan, the island of Holly. So this is a 20th century creation. It was a little island that lies in Bantry Bay, off the coast of County Cork. It was bought from the British Admiralty by an Irish MP, Annan Bryce, in 1910. And this is the most famous part of the garden. It's the Medici house, looking over the sunk garden from the Casita. And if you see the inset, of course, that's a view of the garden in the 1910s. That particular area was greatly inspired by Pompeii. So the owner at the time, Harold Bryce, and also the designer of the garden, had been to Pompeii. So this is, oh, it's annoying. I've got something blocking my view here. I'll just go back. The second person is the garden designer, Harold Pichot, who designed a number of great gardens in Britain, including his own garden, Alfred Manor in Wiltshire. He preferred to work in using the Italian style. And interestingly, actually, he ran a practice in London in which Edwin Lutyens worked as a young man. These are various different views of the island. When they bought it, the family, in 1910, it was without a single tree. There was a bog in the centre of it, and Pitot climbed the highest point of the island, looked down from it, and devised this wonderful Italianate series of rooms, and then included wild Robinsonian areas within the garden. You can see here, reduce. That's better. I can see more now. Is standing in the pond is Mercury. Mercury, of course, is the god of various different items, but rain and warmth and growth is one of them. So this is Ilnacullen. The more or less the formal hard landscape for the garden had been laid out by the late 1920s, by the late 1910s. In the 1920s, a brilliant Scots head gardener came to establish the planting on the island, Murdo Mackenzie, and he laid out the wonderful plant collection that you see there today. And as a young student, of course, you're easily impressed by all of these new plants that you've never seen before. And the plant that impressed me most on Kilmacurragh was Puya alpestre. So this is a bromeliad. It's from Chile. Been lucky enough to see it in the wild. I remember being bowled over by these vividly blue flowers that, of course, are pollinated by hummingbirds in the Andes in Chile. I remember thinking, I've never seen anything like this, and it's remained to this day my favorite plant. We grow it here at Kilmacurragh. It is relatively hardy in coastal situations. Any of you who are gardening in the US, it's hardy to US zone 9. So it can take down to about -4 degrees of frost for a very brief period. Tender rhododendrons, of course, are a real forte of this garden. So these wonderful striped blooms of Rhododendron dalhousie, rhabdotum from Bhutan. But then, of course, you've got Rhododendron Burmanicum, which was named from material that was first raised at Glasnevin. It had been sent to Glasnevin, our Dublin site, by this lady. This is Lady Charlotte Wheeler-Cuff. She was from Lyrath in Kilkenny. And this image of her is taken in about 1911 in Rangoon, now Yangon. She was the wife of an Irish civil engineer. So this is Sir Otway Fortescue Wheeler-Cuff. And while he was sort of off on large civil engineering projects, railways and new roads throughout Burma, she would head off on her pony with her easel painting, but she also collected plants. She was a really brilliant amateur botanist, sent her collections to Glasnevin, and a lot of them were described as being new to science. So that's Lady Charlotte Wheeler-Cuff. Having completed the course at Glasnevin, my first job, actually, I went straight into head gardener of a historic estate on Valentia Island, a large island off the coast of County Kerry in southwest Ireland. In Ireland, actually, if you're in the Midlands, it's quite a cold climate, but once you're on the coast, and particularly if you're on the coast in southwest of Ireland, it is verging on warm temperate. It's said subtropical, it's not subtropical. It is warm temperate, and that allows us to grow all sorts of tender palms and preference from the southern hemisphere. So this is a view overlooking the Glanleam estate on Valentia Island. So Sir Peter Fitzgerald was the 19th Knight of Kerry. He owned it 3/4 of the island, about 5,000 acres. The rest was owned by Trinity College in Dublin. And his family had built this house in the late 17th century. And Peter began creating one of the earliest exotic gardens in Ireland in an extremely windblown area of Ireland, absolutely blasted by hurricane-like forces. So he planted all of the shelter boughs that gradually emerged and protected the exotic collection that he planted. Peter Fitzgerald also had a really powerful yacht. So back then, of course, roads weren't great in Ireland. So the way to visit your friends was that you hopped onto your yacht and you sailed around the inlets in Ireland. Not just that, he was also a great friend of the Dorian Smiths on Tresco. So there are historic records of plants going back and forth between the two gardens, between Glanleam and between the Dorian Smiths on Tresco. So this is the scene today. I tend to end up managing old wreck gardens that need major work. So this was my first big stab at garden restoration. Having worked on Ilnacullen, Cornish Island, I was really pleased to be back on an island garden with this warm climate. So this is the Dell. And if we go back in a time machine to 1880, this is Lady Julia Fitzgerald standing beside a court line at Glanleam. These are early photographs of Dixonia antarctica planted in the dell in about 1880. And this is the scene you see today, sheltered by these gigantic Monterey cypresses. And these are the tallest cabbage trees, Cortland australis, in Britain and Ireland. Tree ferns with trunks up to 20-25 feet tall. It's a really exotic scene, and people coming from continental Europe are shocked by the fact that we can grow these sort of plants outside in Ireland. These are some of the views in front of the house, spectacular views looking over Glanneam Bay, out towards Carrasaveen and the McGilly-Cuddy Reeks. This is leaving the wall garden, going into the woodland garden. This is an early image of Peter himself. It's a historic country house, of course, and the garden is famous for being the site where Luma apiculata Glanneam gold originated. So this is a Chilean myrtle with wonderful cinnamon brown bark and variegated foliage, and these frothy white flowers in summertime. It self-seeds in millions in the garden. Acidic soil, so you get these wonderful blue hydrangeas. So my first trip to China, and I've been back several times, was to Yunnan while I was still head gardener at Glanneam. And Yunnan province was a revelation to me. It is the size of France. It's in southwest China, and it contains half of all of China's plant and animal species. It's got over 25 different ethnic groups. So the upper slides are photographs taken at Dali, which of course was based for people like Jean-Marie Delaveille, George Forrest. The bottom slide is Lijiang, this wonderful medieval city. These are the Nahi people. So this, of course, was a major base for Joseph Rock, the Austrian-American plant hunter. So Glanneam was from 1996 up to 1993 to 96, and 97, I should say, pardon me. I left to become head gardener, moved back up to Dublin to Beach Park, which was the home of the Shackleton family. So they were cousins of the Irish Antarctic explorer, Sir Ernest Shackleton. And Beach Park, the collection there is herbaceous and alpine plants. It was rated by Graham Stewart Thomas as the fourth most important collection of herbaceous and alpine plants in Britain and Ireland. So David Shackleton, who created that collection from for about the 1950s up until the time of his death in the 1980s, was one of the greatest plantsmen in Ireland of his time. He was a great friend of Lady Moore, and he was a great mentor to Helen Dillon. So that's how in Ireland we can trace our plants, that David Shackleton got them from Lady Moore. He passed them on to Helen Dillon. Helen Dillon passed them on to me, and I will obviously continue to pass them on. There was this wonderful wall garden, and you walked through the door, you were transported into another world, because it was just an alpine and herbaceous plantsman's delight. All of the very best plants. South-facing borders full of oriental poppies, north-facing borders full of the largest collection of blue poppies in Britain and Ireland. So it's in the hands of Fingal County Council today, and this is Selmisia David Shackleton. It's the best of all of the New Zealand daisies, and the colour is best described as the colour of a new saucepan. Absolutely aluminium coloured foliage. It's spectacular. In 1997, from Beach Park, I set out on my first trip, retracing the route of the English plant hunter, Captain Frank Kingdon Ward. So I'm writing a biography of Kingdon Ward at the moment. It's a bit of a brave venture to take on, because of all of the plant hunters who have ever travelled the globe. He was in the field for the longest. His first expedition was in 1909, and his very last one was to Mount Victoria in Burma in 1956. He was the son of a Cambridge professor, and his most famous expedition, of course, was to the Sangpo Gorge in southeast Tibet in 1924. So I've been back to that region several times, but these are some slides from our campsite, for example, on the Doshongla. It's a mountain pass that crosses over towards this area. So this is the Sangpo Gorge, which is the deepest natural gorge in the world. Some of the rock walls fall between 5,000 and 7,000 meters back into the river itself. Yeah, so then I moved back to Glasnevin, having studied there. I moved back as a staff member in 2000. And at the time, Glasnevin was being under massive restoration, both the plant collections and the structures. We were busy restoring the curvilinear range, rebuilding libraries, herbaria, the Great Palm House. So this structure is probably the most iconic of our glass houses. It was sent over in kit form from Scotland in 1884. It was put up over a 3-month period at a cost of about £2,500. We completed its restoration in 2004 after 2 years of work on the house at a cost of €15.5 million. So this is the second tallest palm house in Britain and Ireland, with a view obviously in spring with tulips. So my role at Glasnevin was the undertaking of the creation of a new woodland garden, the establishment of a new Chinese collection. And when we had restored that house, we had to reinstate the order beds, the family beds, but using the new system, the updated system of plant families that has been sort of reordered our understanding of plant families, because of course by DNA we now have a better grip on where plant families lie and the relationships between the two. While I was based at Glasnevin, I returned to Tibet, and this was to see the Tibetan flora in summertime in the monsoon. And this is where I've seen, again, a bit like, having seen Huia alpestris flower on the island garden at Garnish at Kilmacurragh. And these are sort of iconic plants that stick in your mind. This is probably the most bizarre plant I've ever seen. It's a giant sorrel, Rheum nobile, so it's a first cousin of rhubarb. And I still remember climbing along here by this enormous lake. It reminds me of an Irish loch like Glendalough. And we'd spent about half a day walking along here. And then suddenly we got to this point, and you could look up and you could see what looked like lighthouses amongst the sea of rhododendrons. And there was a single huge flowering plant of Rheum nobile. Very clever plant. This is it's unusual in that most alpine plants car down to form very low cushion-like plants, but at this altitude. But in this case, it's enormous. It's a bit like the giant lobelias on the mountains of equatorial East Africa. It soars up to over 2 meters tall. But these are bracts, or modified leaves, and what they do is they act as a glasshouse over the flowers, and they protect the plant from really high ultraviolet radiation and from searingly cold winds. But it was just absolutely amazing to turn over this particular slope, turn the corner, and see tens of thousands of plants in bloom, always growing on boulder screen. So this is Rheum nobile. So it's again, it's what makes traveling to see plants in the wild absolutely worthwhile. You need to travel. It's impossible to cultivate. You need to travel out to the Himalaya to see this plant. In 2002, I was a member of the Irish Garden Plant Society Committee, and we decided that we would bring an exhibit to the Chelsea Flower Show. We do it every couple of years. So I was tasked with becoming the chair of a subcommittee to bring an exhibit about the Irish plant hunter, Dr. Augustine Henry, to the Chelsea Flower Show originally it was supposed to be in 2001, but then the foot and mouth suddenly hit Britain and Ireland, so it was postponed and happened instead in 2002. And this is a view that Henry would have been familiar with. The image is taken from the very peak on which he discovered Lilium henryi, probably his best known find, looking down over the city of Yichang, and this is the Yangtze. This is what's called British gunboat diplomacy. This is a British gunboat parked on the Yangtze. This is a treaty port, so if the Chinese decided to close that port, obviously this was here as a preventative measure. Henry was based here during the 1880s. He first began to collect plants because of his work in 1885. So he wrote a letter in 1885 to Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker, who was then in his final year as director at Kew. And he expressed the difficulties he was having, because one of his jobs was to put tariffs and to put levies and taxes on many of the plant-derived medicinal products that were being shipped down the Yangtze. So this is the famous Three Gorges, which is just above Yichang. And he could get the colloquial names of these plants, but he just couldn't get the Latin names. What he didn't realize was actually that he was in an entirely new flora. So Joseph Hooker wrote back to him and he said, absolutely. Hooker, of course, was at the center of empire botany. He was really keen looking for new products to be exported from Kew across the empire. And over the course of the next 15 years, from 1885 to the end of 1900, Augustine Henry sent 158,000 herbarium specimens to Kew. They were distributed to places like Edinburgh, to Dublin, to New York, to Berlin, and so on. This is a photograph that appeared in a book he later wrote with Henry Elwes, The Trees of Great Britain in Ireland. The photograph was taken at Chongqing by a lady from County Cork, Mrs. Archibald Little, and it's a 2,000-year-old ginkgo tree, a maidenhair tree growing by a temple. It is a remarkable story, and I wrote a biography of Augustine Henry much later. It was published in 2011. And these are some of the images that I gathered for it. So these are Augustine Henry's original plant collectors, and they were later rehired by E.H. Wilson, Ernest Henry Wilson, who followed in Augustine Henry's footsteps and introduced many of his discoveries. Henry was later based in the 1890s in Taiwan, and there he hired the chief of an Aboriginal tribe who were based here, a place called Banking Sing. And these were the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, and they fought with Chinese settlers. They were not allowed to marry until they had taken the head of at least one Chinese person. But it's a really interesting photograph, that how you could line up that face staring straight at you. It's pretty gruesome, and that photograph was taken by E.H. Wilson in 1917 when he visited the island to introduce more of Augustine Henry's collections. So these are some images, excuse me, from our visit to this part of China. It all began, of course, at the Chelsea Flower Show. So this is the late Duke of Edinburgh. Very sad that both the Duke and the Queen has now disappeared. At the Chelsea Flower Show in 2002, in May 2002, less than 6 months later, I was leading a group down the Yangtze. We climbed Mount Omi and made our way down to Hubei province to visit some of the areas that had been first explored by Augustine Henry. We returned again in 2004 and 2005. But what I found remarkable was that some of the great trees, so this is a ginkgo tree that's all of 1,000 years old. It produces over 250 kilos of fruit every year. And close to it is a slightly younger tree, 800 years old. But this farmer who's standing beside me, he was harvesting his crop, food crop of Amorphophilus konjac, and he told me that his family, over that 8th century period, had been the dynastic guardians of that tree. And there's very few places where you can claim something like that, and China is one of those places. Fascinating flora, and actually a flora that's very well adapted to British and Irish conditions. In 2006, I moved down from Glasnevin to take on the second phase at Kilmacurragh, and that was the replanting and the restoration of the estate. So we've 104 acres of gardens, estate woodlands and parkland, huge deer park that we've just recently bought back, and a wall garden. Kilmacurragh was firstly an abbey. It later became the possession of the Byrne family. They were ousted by Oliver Cromwell in 1649 when he marched to the estate, and the lands were redistributed in 1650 to the Acton family. They were originally from a little village called Acton Burnell in Shropshire. They'd lived there since the 12th century. Oliver Cromwell, when he came to Ireland, he redistributed 2.8 million acres of land. So the Acton family were given several acres, several towns' lands, and the estate covered about 5,500 acres. They lived in several houses before they built this house. So this is Kilmacurragh House. It was designed by a famous architect called Sir William Robinson. It was built in 1697. And the two flanking wings were built during the Great Famine in Ireland. They were built in 1848 at a time when over 1 million Irish people had starved to death. The Actons were decent landlords. They were resident landlords and resident landlords with a social conscience. So they mounted famine relief projects on the estate and saved over 100 families that they'd brought in from the west of Ireland from starvation. So this is Thomas, who built the house in 1697, and various different other members of the family. Poor old Kilmacurragh saw sad times in the 20th century. It was inherited by Captain Charles Ansiball Acton. That last generation of the family went to rugby school in England. They trained as soldiers at Sandhurst. So of the 3 boys, all of them had died in early 20th century wars. So Captain Acton's younger brother Veer died when he was just 18 in the Boer War in South Africa. Captain Acton himself died in 1914. He'd previously been a soldier in Burma. And his only remaining brother, Reggie, was killed in just 8 months later. And what that meant was that Isabel, who you see standing on the doorstep of the house in 1932, she inherited debt duties that amounted to almost 100% of the value of the estate, and the family were bankrupted, and that's why the house fell into ruin. So these are views of Kilmacurragh. From about 1850, the gardens saw seismic change. When the house was first built, it was surrounded by a rigidly formal Dutch park, and it was inherited by the famous Thomas Acton, and he and his sister Janet gardened here for the next 50 years. Their garden advisor was Dr. David Moore from Glasnevin, and he was succeeded, of course, as garden advisor by his son, Sir Frederick Moore. This is an image of the Broadwalk in about the late 1870s. It's an absolutely Victorian structure. It's about 10 meters wide. It is lined by Irish yews, Taxus baccata, fastigiata, and alternating plants of the Highclere rhododendron, Rhododendron alticlarense with Rhododendron Cunningham's white, and Phormium tenax. So they were gathered in 1860. Thomas and Janet set off on a grand tour. They departed from the Nome because, unlike their ancestors, they were looking at trees and plants in their native habitat. So the Phormiums were seedlings that had been raised from their travels in New Zealand. If we fast forward 20 years, this is 1894, and at that time, people coming to visit gardens marveled at the fact that the rhododendrons were 20 feet tall, but if they were to come back in that time machine, this is what they would see today. So this is the views down the Broadwalk with enormous Rhododendron alticlarense, 60 feet tall, forming this enormous tunnel, and with these wonderful carpets of fallen blossoms in sort of mid-May. And those fallen blossoms are said to be as symbolic as the Flanders poppies, given the history of the family in the Great War. For anybody who is not familiar with this rhododendron, Highclere, of course, is where Downton Abbey was filmed, Highclere Castle. By the turn of the 20th century, outside Glasnevin, Kilmacurragh was the most important private plant collection on the island of Ireland. It had the largest collection of species rhododendrons from the Himalaya in Europe. And in 1893, it won the Banks Gold Medal for the finest collection of species conifers in Britain and Ireland. So this is one of the rarest conifers in cultivation, Podocarpus nubigenus, which nubigenus meaning living or born amongst the clouds. So this is the tree today. This is the same tree in 1904. Behind it is a Lawson cypress, and you can see that towering up behind it today. The Wellingtonia appears in Janet Acton's diary, planted on the pond lawn on the 22nd of November 1868. We've got the very date of planting of that tree. What really transformed Kilmacurragh into the wonderful plantsman's garden that it is was the arrival of Joseph Hooker's seeds from Kew on the 22nd of April 1850. So Joseph Hooker, who you could see here, travelled in Sikkim over a 3-year period. His collections were sent back to Europe and all over the world. They were sent down to Kilmacurragh in 1862. In 1866, 2007, just 5 years later, David Moore wrote to Joseph Hooker saying, I saw last week a dozen of your rhododendrons flourishing outside in Wicklow. They found it bizarre that these rhododendrons from the subcontinent would flourish. And that was to set the basis of what was to become this incredibly important rhododendron collection. But this is Janet Acton, Thomas's daughter, standing in the doorcase of the house in 1894. So India, for the first 70 years of the Victorian garden at Kilmacurragh, was the major supplier of plants. And then suddenly, by the 1880s, because of the treaties that followed after the Opium War, suddenly China opened up, and at one point there were over 2,500 Roman Catholic missionaries, mostly French, based in China, and many of them became great plant hunters and naturalists. So you just need to think of Père David, of course, who has the handkerchief tree, Davidia is named for him, or Père Delavé, and their collections were being sent home, followed by Augustine Henry, who opened the way for the professional plant hunters. And you can see it's much changed times. It's the Royal Botanic Gardens, Glasnevin, in County Dublin. Victoria is on the throne, and it's new Chinese rhododendrons. So this has opened the floodgates. This is the golden era of plant introduction. And so many rhododendrons come in that we changed the way that we garden. And this is the reason that the formal garden at Kilmacurragh was swept away. And we enter a period known as rhododendron mania. Amongst the rhododendrons that came to Kilmacurragh, and particularly from Kew in the 1890s, were the collections of Père Delavé. So he was a French missionary who climbed this mountain in 1883. So this is the Kangshan mountain above Dali. And his collections were sent back to the Vilmorin Nursery outside of Paris. And such was the fame of Kilmacurragh that the Vilmorin Nursery dispatched seedlings to Kew, but they were sent directly from Kew to Thomas Acton at Kilmacurragh, with the result that some of them, including rhododendron 0'Brien subspecies Delavei, their first flowering outside of China was in the gardens here in Kilmacurragh. And then, of course, it all crashed down. By the end of the Second World War, 70% of the lands in Britain and Ireland had changed ownership because of debt duties. So this is an image, very sad image, really, in our archives. And this is Colonel Charles Ball Acton. He was a soldier in India. He introduced many plants to cultivation, including Berberis angulosa. And of his three boys, this is Fear, who died in the Boer War, Charles, who inherited the estate, died in 1915, and Reggie, who died just 8 months later. 15 people from this estate died in the Great War. Not just that, at Glasnevin, 3 people died, including our assistant keeper, Charles Frederick Ball. And these ginkgos and cordlines in our wall garden, they never made it out from the field nursery over the garden wall into the outer garden, because suddenly it went from a staff of 11 men and 2 boys to the head gardener left on his own. And gradually the gardens began to go over. So you can imagine what the family felt like. This is the telegram announcing that the last son has been killed in the war. And not just that, debt duties followed, and that devastated the estate. So for 50 years, Kilmacurragh was abandoned. The garden gates were closed over, and it just grew over. Unfortunately, somebody also grazed their cattle in the garden. But this is the lie of the land. This is the house, courtyard. I'm speaking to you from here, I actually live in this wing. Wonderful wildflower meadows, this lovely woodland garden behind. This is the main part of the garden. It doesn't include the outer parts, the deer park, and so on. And when you are here in April, you get this kaleidoscopic display of old historic rhododendrons. I was allowed to settle into Kilmacurragh for a month in May 2006 when I moved down, before I shipped off for a couple of months to the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in London to complete their course in Botanic Gardens Management. So this is the Temperate House, of course, and this is Kew's Great Palm House, which was constructed by Turner in Dublin and sent over from Dublin here in Ireland in kit form and erected in London. When I was based at Kew, I was really lucky because I had 2 mentor figures. One of them was the person who laid out the new management plan for the Sir Harold Hillier Arboretum, and also the curator at the time of the University of Cambridge Botanic Gardens. So with them, I devised a new development plan for the garden. So this is our front avenue, by the way. So this gives you an idea of what we faced in the beginning. And historically, this had been an old silver fir avenue, wonderfully formal, that led out into a huge open park. We cleared it because it had been planted in the 40s with commercial timber. And the idea was, of course, that it is replanted nowadays as an Araucaria avenue. So we travelled out to Chile in 2007, collecting for Kilmacurragh. And just wonderful. I know you either love or you hate monkey puzzles or Chile pines, Araucaria araucana, but I can't tell you how wonderful it was to see monkey puzzles in their wild native habitat. And of course, they're very different plants to the clone that grows in Britain and Ireland. That's Volcanantuco behind, by the way, the most active volcano in Chile. And very quickly, because I know I'm beginning to go over time, from 2012, I began to bring groups out to Sikkim, being surrounded by Joseph Hooker's rhododendrons. I brought out groups to Sikkim over a 4-year period. One of those was in the springtime to see these plants in bloom. And of course, I later published in 2018 a biography of Joseph Dalton Hooker. This is Darjeeling, spectacular place, perched up at 7,000 feet in the foothills of the Himalaya, looking straight out onto Kanchenjunga, which rises, believe it or not, over 26,000 feet above your eye level. This is St. Paul's, by the way. It's Eton in India, a very exclusive boys' school where originally British and Irish, the sons of British and Irish soldiers were schooled. Nowadays, it's where the royal families of Asia go to school. Wonderful to see the national tree of Sikkim. So this is Rhododendron niveum. It's one of the rarest rhododendrons in the world. To see it in its native habitat, wonderful coloured flowers. And Tasmania, of course, as well. Very briefly, I've travelled out to Tasmania twice. Our last expedition was a major expedition, British-Irish expedition to Tasmania, in which we had permits from the government of Australia to collect plants, and we're growing a lot of those today. This is the King Billy pine, by the way, Atrataxis cupressoides, which is highly threatened in the wild. And then on to Myanmar, or Burma. So again, it's part of Frank Kingdom Ward's trail. We also traveled, so this is a little place called Wasan Dum in the subtropical hill jungles of Burma. We've left all of civilization behind us. Wonderful spot, no mobile phones, no signal, just a wonderful place to escape into. And one of my specialist areas is, of course, grassland ecosystems and wildflower meadows. And this meadow was spectacular. It rained on the day, but this is in November and it is just absolutely brimming full of flowers. Thousands of alliums, Allium willichii in this case, lots of pearl everlasting, geraniums, roscoes, by the way, growing in tens of thousands through that meadow in full flower in November. So this is a view of our meadows at Kilmacurragh. We grow about 7 acres of species-rich and incredibly orchid-rich meadows. This particular meadow covers over 3 acres. It's in front of the house. But if you're here in springtime, particularly in February, about 1 million little crocus furnace flower in that meadow. And it's my favorite way to garden. It's a very wild garden. It is called a Robinsonian garden, but actually William Robinson was a friend of the family. He came here on a regular basis. And this is alongside places like Fosha and Kilmacurragh. It's where he gleaned a lot of ideas about naturalistic gardening. We're also busy restoring structures. So I've mentioned a couple of times Kilmacurragh House. So we move on the restoration of Kilmacurragh House in the autumn of next year. The house is Queen Anne, which is quite rare in Ireland. We demolished most of our Queen Anne houses, the late 17th century houses, to be replaced by these enormous neoclassical manors. So it's a very rare survivor. So we begin phase 1 next year. It's a €5.5 million project, which will allow us to re-roof it, weatherproof it, and let it dry out. And then we move into phase 2, which is an €8.5 million project to refit the house inside and reopen it as a historic country house. I'm going to finish with this view. It's of our herbaceous border with an image of the Irish artist Andrea Jameson painting with Echium pinanana from La Palma, one of the Canary Islands, where it's highly threatened, looking down there. That was absolutely derelict until a few years before then. But the wonderful thing about herbaceous plants as opposed to trees and shrubs is that in a very short space of time it gives results. That's Rosa, Madame Isaac Perrier in the background, by the way, probably one of the most highly scented of all roses. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and that's my take on what I've done in Irish gardening over the last 30 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My goodness, Seamus, what a career. I mean, it makes me exhausted listening to it. First question is, when is the book out, and what's the name? What's the title going to be?
Yeah, so it's part of a trilogy. So the first book was in the footsteps of Augustine Henry,
right,
and his Chinese plant collectors. The second one was in the footsteps of Joseph Dalton Hooker and his, let me see, A Sikkim Adventure. So this is going to be in the footsteps of Captain Frank Kingdon Ward. I haven't thought of a subtitle yet, and because I write it in my own time, and because it's such a big subject, it's probably a few years away yet.
Yeah.
Q Publishing have said that they'll take it, that they'll publish it. So I think you're looking at the outset about 3 years away, because generally when you send your manuscript to publishers, it's 18 months before you see a hard copy in your hands.
Yeah. So did you say about 3 years away?
About 3 years away.
Yeah. Okay.
Getting plugs in for it already, Annie.
Yeah, I will. I'm going to start saving now. That was incredible, absolutely incredible.
We've had a question about funding, about the funding for Kilmacurragh's development. Where's that come from?
Yeah, it actually, and we're really grateful to them, but it comes from the Irish taxpayer. So we have quite a small population. So it's not the same as the situation as you would see in the United Kingdom. So normally in the United Kingdom, English Heritage or the National Trust would manage a property like Kilmacurragh. It stands out as being, the house is the equivalent of English Heritage Grade 1. So it's an incredibly important structure. The collection is internationally important as well. So we're very lucky that it's been recognised as such. And because we're part of the National Botanic Gardens of Ireland, we're managed by National Historic Properties. It's a branch of the Office of Public Works. So we're state funded. Our funding comes from the Irish taxpayer. Mm-hmm. But what we give back in return is that we have incredible visitor numbers. And County Wicklow, it's a little bit like the home counties in England in that we have the greatest concentration of great gardens and great estates in Ireland. We're very close to Dublin, so we're a massive tourism spinner. More people come to Ireland to look at gardens than visit golf courses. We generate an enormous revenue. So over time, we actually do pay back for ourselves. But saying that, no, we are a money trap. You know, it takes a lot of money to restore an old place like Kilmacurragh. You know, when you look at the Deer Park alone, there's kilometres of ha-has that need to be rebuilt, and they'll be rebuilding those structures, you know, for the next few decades.
Yeah. Mark wants to know the name of the rose that you mentioned in the border there. Was it?
Oh yeah, it's French, and if you give a French name to a rose, it sounds even better. So it's Madame Isaac Perrier.
Isaac Perrier, okay, yeah.
And I've got a really bad sense of smell, but you put your nose into it and it's fruity. It's your granny's garden. It's a wonderful rose.
Wow. And then also there's a question about plant hunting now. You know, you mentioned permits, but what else is involved? You know, the modern day plant hunter, what are the sort of things that you've got to take into consideration?
Yeah, the most important thing to remember is that every country has a sovereign right to their plants. So it's not the case that, you know, when you talk about the early plant hunters, they could literally just walk into a country, they could take what they wanted. There was no restrictions, there was no regulations. The easiest and the best case to explain is that if you look at the case of rubber, which was taken from Brazil, and it was brought to the colonies, particularly to Malaysia, and it became a multi-billion-pound industry. Brazil got absolutely nothing back in return. The plant collector who collected the seeds of the rubber plant, he's known in Brazil today as a biopirate. Right. So nowadays, every country has a sovereign right to their plants, and that goes into intellectual property as well. Right.
Yeah.
So you cannot just walk into, and particularly being, we're a state-funded national botanic garden, so we need to do it by the book. So our latest expedition, for example, was to Tasmania. We've also recently had permits from Chile, from China. So to make your collections legal, you need to abide by the Convention of Biological Diversity and the Gaia Protocol, but you do that by getting your permits from the government of the country.
Right. And where is your next trip going to be? Have you planned that yet?
Yes, actually, I'm bringing a group out to the mountains of equatorial East Africa at the end of January.
Wow.
So when I was a kid, actually, I think I was training at Glasnevin, so I wasn't quite a kid. I was about 19 at the time. My dad gave me a book. I don't know where he got it, but it's by a British botanist of Irish background, a guy called Patrick Singh, who was a botanist with the British Museum. And he traveled through the mountains of East Africa in the 1940s. And his writing, he just writes so well. And that book it's called, and you can get it online, it's called Plants with Personality by Patrick Singh. And he talks about seeing the giant silicios and giant groundsels on the mountains of East Africa. So these are lobelias that grow to 10 meters tall. Wow. I've always wanted to see them. So in the end of January, I'm bringing a group out, and we're going to climb Mount Kenya.
And how do people get onto your trip? I mean, I'm assuming there's a waiting list, and I'm assuming these are all professionals. So tell me how you put this group together.
So it's funny, actually. People just assume that I do it commercially. I don't actually.
No.
So you need to be somebody that I know. There's two criteria, because
you've got to like them.
You've got to like them. I need to know that I'm going to get on with you. But also, as well, the second most important factor is that you need to love plants. Absolutely love plants. So I've brought people from sort of Britain and Ireland over the last while. The other thing that I always keep it to about 8 people.
Right.
If it gets bigger than that, it fractures. The groups sort of break up. So I try to keep groups not too large.
Right. And where you must have a list, of places still to go and visit, and what's on that list?
Yeah, Mexico. I would love to. I want to see penstemons in the wild. I want to see Pinus montezumi in the wild. I want to go to Western Australia. They reckon that one of the places where you can still find new species is Western Australia.
Right.
So there's multiple places. New Caledonia. I would love to go to New Caledonia. And actually, I'd like to get back. I've done a bit of plant hunting in California, but I'd like to get sort of further up into Washington State. I'd like to see more of South Africa. I've touched on the Drakensberg, but I'd like to go back there as well. So yeah, there's never enough time.
Well, exactly. My goodness, but you've made the most of the time you've already had. Crikey, it's wonderful. And also, I mean, amazing how you packed in all the history into this talk as well, of all the different gardens. And it's just fascinating, isn't it?
I love garden history, and I think that sort of kick-started from Glasnevin, because it is a historic garden. But it's always good to know who's done what and who's gone before you,
Yeah.
And
I'm glad you said that about the monkey puzzle tree, because they are not my favorite tree, and partly because they're always in this country planted in the wrong bloody place.
Yes, exactly.
And we've got some planted locally here, I would say in the wild, but on the edge of forestry, and they just look ridiculous. They just look so out of place, and they just feel wrong.
There's a clump of them that the Hergest estate, which can't remember names, strong RHS connections, that they planted a whole lot on Herefordshire hilltop for the millennium, for 2000. And they will be magnificent. I mean, they're incredibly wind tolerant, and that's just the right place for them.
I should imagine they're deer tolerant too, aren't they?
Yes.
When you see them in the wild, they're ridge-top trees. So you're absolutely right, Noel. But if you're visiting Kilmacurragh, there's a hill behind the estate called West Aston Hill, and on top of it are araucarias, and that's where you need to see araucarias or monkey puzzles. Yeah.
Wow. Well, we've had lots of amazing comments, and we'll copy the comment box and send it to you, Seamus.
Thank you.
The latest comment, Hester Ford, saying great talk, and I can see she's packing her bag already, and she's getting her stuff ready for your next trip.
Good. Well, I know Hester, and it'd be a pleasure to have Hester at some stage in the future.
Wow, no, that really absolutely fascinating. And yeah, some of those gardens down, I'm next time I go and see Hester, I want to go and see some of those ones down on the west coast. They're just so beautiful, aren't they?
Yeah.
Oh,
Irish Riviera.
yeah, the Irish Riviera indeed. Yeah, there's something good about all that rain, isn't there?
Yeah.
Gosh, that's brilliant. Oh yeah, you're being invited to Seattle as well, so there you go.
I love Seattle. Yeah, I'd love to get back.
Yeah. Oh,
Right.
that's great.
Great,
So,
thanks
I mean,
so much, Seamus. That was
it was fantastic.
terrific.
What an uplifting talk for a dank old winter day. It's great. Thank
My
you.
pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, lovely.
Yes.
Thank you, and good luck with the book.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
All right, take
All
care.
right, thank you,
Bye.
Seamus. Bye.
Bye. Bye.